Hi, it's Tom from Digital Foundry with a close technical look at the Dark Souls 3 network stress test that ran last weekend. This is running on PS4 and on first glance it might look rather familiar. On the surface there's an obvious overlap in technology with Bloodborne, which released earlier this year, and given how great it looked then, that's no bad thing. As From Software's first effort on current gen consoles, Bloodborne really blazed a trail with some of the studio's more experimental ideas, both in its nightmarish aesthetic and the technology underneath. It was a great PS4 exclusive, but where does that leave Dark Souls 3? Well, it's a multi-platform game to start, coming to PS4, Xbox One and PC next spring, and it's obvious looking at this early build that there are some ideas being reintroduced. Now we have to say this is far from the finished product of course, but here's our first 5 impressions of the Dark Souls 3 stress test and the technology behind it. Number 1, it's using the Bloodborne engine. Now needless to say, Bloodborne was a stunning release that really pushed ahead of what we saw in Dark Souls 2. Even compared to the Scholar of the First Sin remaster on PS4, it looked a generation ahead. It was a full 1080p game, but also brought a new engine that featured a dynamic lighting model, bringing detailed specular mapping across Yharnam to life. Added to that, we had individually lit particle effects playing across walls, plus an increase in concurrent light sources across the world. Now we get all of this with Dark Souls 3 as well. It's running at a full 1080p native resolution on PS4, leaving details looking sharp in the distance. The same also goes for the anti-aliasing method. You may notice this high wall of Lothric area suffers from a similar pixel crawl to Bloodborne as we turn the camera past certain elements. A light post-process AA is in play, but on most geometric edges it's ineffective. It means these aspects look a bit rough in this stress test, but the base 1080p image means the game always looks crisp. As for lighting, the high wall of Lothric is exposed to much more sunlight than anything in Bloodborne. It's a change in art style, but the actual method of lighting and character shadows is principally the same underneath. Armor reflects realistically while outdoors, and shadows cast dynamically. We even get a similar implementation of ambient occlusion underneath plants, adding depth to the scene. For all intents and purposes, this is the same engine used over again. Number 2, Lothric looks huge. We've only seen a slice of what Dark Souls 3 has to offer in terms of level design, but some things stand out. First off, Lothric Castle is potentially one of the biggest areas we've seen in a Souls game, especially being the first Souls title built with PS4 and Xbox One in mind from the start. Fans of the series will feel right at home with the winding stone stairways across the kingdom's outer wall, and it in many ways has parallels with the Anor Londo stage of the first Dark Souls. It's a huge city, bright, sprawling, densely layered with hidden shortcuts and mechanical lifts. If it's like previous games, much of it will be explorable too, so long as it's within sight. Working down to the lower burgs, Bloodborne's influence becomes obvious though. It filters down to a gothic town centre filled with spires and more crooked tar black gates. This is a more complex, ornate style that we just didn't get in last gen Dark Souls games. Series director Hidetaka Miyazaki states there is a commonality between this and his last creation, and we can expect many later areas to have a similar gothic twist. As for enemies, Dark Souls 3 pushes the engine in a different direction. Lothric is filled with smaller clusters of undead knights and mages, using nothing like the fur shaders of Bloodborne's townsfolk and beasts. On the other hand, every turret on the wall is occupied by a wyvern, a huge, beautifully detailed presence that fills the area with transparency effects when walking close. As far as the engine goes, it's a big difference in the way Dark Souls 3 pushes the PS4 hardware. At least based on this sampler, we're seeing less outlandish designs for regular enemies, but with the potential for a different style of chaos that we didn't get in Bloodborne. And of course, we're only touching on the surface of what the final game will bring in terms of later areas and enemies. Number 3, it runs like Bloodborne. Now you've likely already spotted this by eye. Dark Souls 3 abandons the 60 FPS target of the Dark Souls 2 remaster on PS4, and now we're running at a half rate of refresh. It's a 30 FPS game with VSync just like Bloodborne, and based on this early test, Dark Souls 3 has the very same frame pacing issues as Bloodborne as well. For reference, here's analysis footage of From Software's last game, where we get stutters due to an uneven distribution of frames. We're mostly getting an average 30 FPS from the game, but the frame time graph on the left shows these frames aren't ordered properly. Now hopefully this will be addressed by a release for the new game. Controls are sharp and responsive as we've mentioned, and there's a real potential to build on what Bloodborne started. Number 4. Effects are being tweaked. Now this is a mixed bag. Transparency effects like fire and even heavy sprays of blood transfer straight from Bloodborne at full resolution. There's no paring back on the quality here, and particle effects in particular look superb when swords clash with shields and masonry. And as you can see, crashing through objects also creates a more exaggerated cloud of dust than in previous games. These are huge billows of smoke, and it's something that really stands out in this indoors area. In this sense, Dark Souls 3 really delivers on the spectacle. But something else is missing. In Bloodborne, From Software used the Yebis 3 middleware. It's a post-processing suite that enhances colour, adds depth of field, motion blur, and other filters like chromatic aberration. But notably in Dark Souls 3, we're currently missing motion blur entirely, an effect that even made it into the last gen versions of Dark Souls 2. It's a strange cut, and we're curious to see if it will be reinstated for the final build. On the plus side, we keep the depth of field effect, though chromatic aberration is also missing. This filter distorted the image in Bloodborne, producing an effect similar to an old camera lens. It made sense in the context of that game's gothic art style, but was also pretty heavy in its use. In practice, it created a rainbow pattern on high contrast edges, and often had the side effect of exaggerating the game's aliasing. So it wasn't to everyone's taste, and Dark Souls fans might be relieved to hear that that's gone. In our book, it makes sense to keep it this way for Dark Souls 3. The image is cleaner and brighter as is, but whether we get motion blur back remains to be seen. Number 5. Physics are in full force. If there's one big thing Dark Souls 3 doesn't hold back on, it's the heavy use of physics-based simulation. Walls and scenery are mostly static as ever, but we get full cloth simulation on cloaks and flags this time, used in abundance across the Lothric wall. Here the effect brings the area to life in a way we didn't see in early games. And of course, there's also the trademark ragdoll physics on downed enemies, an effect that wasn't in play with Dark Souls 2 either. In that game, defeated enemies simply fell to the floor and couldn't be moved, or otherwise just turned into dust on the spot. But in line with early Souls games and Bloodborne, we get full ragdoll simulation on downed enemies here, no matter how big or small the foe. From Software also goes all out on Havoc-based physics destruction too. It's a classic feature of the Souls series, but there's a sense from this network stress test that it's been taken to a new extreme. Overall, it makes the world feel more interactive and less fixed in place. So in review, Dark Souls 3 is looking really promising right now, even this early on. It's currently missing a few features we expected to return from Bloodborne, but there's also a sense it's pushing in its own unique direction with enemy and level designs. As for the core engine work, it's very familiar territory, and we're looking forward to seeing what other wild, fantastical areas From Software has in mind for the game. Anyway, that's all for now. Hope you liked it. If you did, just throw us a like or subscribe below, and look forward to catching you in the next one.